Next up, we will have a discussion between three service companies who are leading the charge in selling digitalization services to help clients decarbonize. In a nutshell, that means selling energy efficiency, supply chain tracking, cloud computing, automation, and the like, specifically to reduce CO2 emissions. To date, digitalization has been mostly adopted to save money, but companies like Schneider Electric, Circulor, and Microsoft have found that there's increasing interest from clients not only to save money, but also CO2. So on this panel, they'll discuss success stories and challenges they faced in scaling these digital decarbonization services. Again, it's a panel discussion, so we will have time for Q&A. Do submit your questions in the chat box. And before we get started, we will kick off with a live polling question. So again, we do want to hear your take. So the question is, which industry do you think will move fastest to capitalize on the sustainability benefits of digitalization? Oil and gas, heavy manufacturing and automotive, power and utilities, or metals and mining? Do submit your answers, and we'll get to the results in a second. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce you to our panel. The session will be moderated by Claire Curry, Head of Digital Industry at BNEF, and Claire will be joined by Veera Johnson, co-founder of Circulor, Vanessa Miler-Fels, Director of Energy Innovation and Impact at Microsoft, and Susan Uthayakumar, President of Sustainable Business Division at Schneider Electric. Welcome to our panelists, and Claire, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Veera. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing those polling results when they pop up. Generally, as Daniel was saying, industries have been chasing digital transformation for a number of years now, with the main goal of reducing costs, improving customer services, finding new revenue streams. And decarbonization has been less of a major goal for many digital strategy teams at corporates. But we really think this will change. And part of the reason we put this polling question is because these are four of the big areas that we look at as BNEF, and we think all of them have the real potential to embrace digital for decarbonization. We can see the results here are quite heavily skewed to power and utilities, which makes sense because of their renewables build and the digitalization of that. But actually quite a lot here towards automotive and heavy manufacturing, which is interesting. We will definitely get to talk about that on the panel with a couple of our panelists. Now, there are already some large corporates using technologies like blockchain or satellites and AI to track emissions, but these projects are often quite ad hoc, not corporate-wide, and have kind of hit roadblocks. Very happily, my three panelists today are at the forefront of a new market opportunity to become a digital decarbonization partner to large corporates, working across a business to help clients set climate goals, track emissions, and hit those targets. I really look forward to hearing what the panelists have to say around promising digital technologies, about those polling results which seem to show power utilities first, then manufacturing, autos, then oil and gas and mining. So yeah, thank you. So that's the result there. We'll come back to that at the end. First up, let me kick off with a question for each of you. Which digital technologies have you all been using in your own decarbonization, and which applications are you advising your clients tackle first in their own journey towards net zero or their climate goals? And Vanessa, let's start with you and Microsoft's thoughts here.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you very much for inviting me, and pleasure to share a panel for such esteemed women. But so I think for us that we really map our journey with what we call the 5 R's: record, report, reduce, replace, remove. And so we really think there is a place for digital innovation in all of the 5, but it really start with the record and the report first. These are the first steps. And I think this is where we're seeing a lot of innovation around kind of carbon accounting management technologies, and where there's a maybe the biggest gap too in terms of where we are and what we need to be. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the challenges we're all facing as an industry here to understand where and what we're tracking in real time.
Okay, so from your point of view, we need to understand where we are, at least how many emissions how much emissions corporates actually are responsible for before we can really get to the tackling part of it?
I think, it goes both ways. We want to, reduce as quickly as possible, and we kind of are on a 10-year journey for Microsoft. We have a 2030 goal. That's kind of tomorrow, but that's also what the science is telling us we need to do to be carbon negative by 2030. So we're moving with the data we have today, but we also expect that over the next decade, the data that will underpin our sustainability strategy and strategies will be a lot better. And again, we'll need to move from really this analog to digital, and from this yearly reporting, sometimes lagging in a couple years, to real-time reporting. And that's going to be a huge shift. And again, it's not going to be possible to do in every piece of our operations at the same pace. It's a lot easier to do it for what we call scope 1 and scope 2, so our direct emissions and the emissions from electricity. It's not there yet, but I think it's easier to do than it will be for supply chain, obviously. And I think we'll talk a lot about the challenges that come with supply chain decarbonization and data reporting, and also emissions reduction, and what's the role for technology here.
And Susan, do you see that as well? Schneider's obviously also a large corporation. You're managing your own emissions, but you're also working with client groups to help them. Are you recommending too they start with reporting, and what other technologies are you seeing appetite for?
So I very much agree with what Vanessa just brought up, which is that I see digitalization as a great enabler of decarbonization. So when we say digitalization, what we mean by that is obviously making sure that we use data in our process to bring transparency and intelligence to the decision making. So by doing that, we have what we call our resource advisor platform, whereby you can digitize all of the data streams that also track your emissions. And by having this visibility on what your current carbon footprint is, you can set your goal for your organization in line with your emission goal. So many companies want to be zero emission by a specific timeline, and having that data and looking at both real-time data as well as historical patterns, it allows you to make more smarter and more efficient decisions in your operation. And the real outcome of that is that you have more productivity, you have less waste, you can prevent downtime, and when you use resources efficiently, then of course you have lower emission as part of your overall emission strategy for your company. So what we do at Schneider is we engage with our clients in whichever stage they're in their decarbonization pathway to get them to their real outcomes and their real goals in their decarbonization journey.
Okay, and Veera, you're obviously in the business of this point about real-time data, tracking and tracing where information is coming from, with helping with reporting. Do you feel like that's also kind of right now the most needed part of the digital toolbox for sustainability?
I absolutely agree. And how we're doing it is by creating transparency in the supply chain and tracking the actual physical raw material as it changes state, as it goes through manufacturing and recycling supply chains. We're able to create a chain of custody of that material, which means that we have absolute visibility and data all the way from source to end product, which means that we know the mass balance of material going in at each step of the production process, but also the participants in that journey, which means that from that perspective, we're able to capture the direct scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And by virtue of creating that chain of custody, we're able to attach a scope 3 emission, which means from that perspective, the end manufacturer or the participant in the supply chain can choose to either change their production processes, improve them to reduce their carbon emission, or equally reduce the supply chain or change suppliers if that's what's required. But also it allows organizations then, from a consumer and stakeholder perspective, to look at how best to offset the carbon emission.
I see. So a big part of this seems to be being able to work across a whole client's business. It's not one-off ad project, it actually is quite time consuming. And this idea of being a partner across the C-suite, across a whole range of departments, seems to be relatively a new area. Like, I don't really see that many service companies and tech companies, as you three are really saying this is a real opportunity for us and a really big new revenue stream, maybe partly because it does seem like a lot of work. Do you have any thoughts, maybe Vanessa first again, on why your company specifically sees this as an opportunity when other big tech firms aren't necessarily, and where you, I guess, hope to see Microsoft go with this idea of helping other firms decarbonize?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's many elements to that are both internal and external. With over the last few years, we've seen really an acceleration of the number of companies committing to net zero and looking for solutions. And at the same time, we've also accelerated our own journey. And while we focused initially maybe on our own carbon footprint, so again, on scope 1 and 2, and, we're executing on solutions that are maybe more mainstream, like corporate PPAs, when we start and already leveraging digital technologies, but mostly on energy efficiency, where it's, I think, where most of us start. So we started more than 10 years ago with the project for our campus called 88 acres, because that was the initial size of our campus at Microsoft in Redmond, Washington State, and then obviously deployed energy efficiency in data centers. Then when we start looking at supply chain, it became clear that it's really about systemic change, and that partnership will be key to get solution to scale and to bring the carbon abatement costs down. And so when we looked at that, and a solution we'll need to have in our hands to be able to meet our goals, particularly in the next decade, whether it's partnership with utilities and really figuring out how do we enable the decarbonization of the grid in this accelerated timeline that also the administration is looking to deliver. How do we decarbonize the supply chain, going not only from our direct suppliers, but really deep to the mining, and that apparently most of the listeners don't think are the most ready to adopt digital solutions. It seems that we have a huge opportunity to just kind of get to a scale that is just way beyond Microsoft's own carbon footprint. Our own carbon footprint is about 15 million metric ton. And when we work with BP, we announced a partnership with, or Shell also, we announced a partnership with last year, this is 50 times bigger. And so the solutions we can develop with them have a tremendous impact, obviously, for not just for us, but for others. But also it's kind of learnings that we can then take on and benefit from to lower our own carbon emission at a lower cost. So it's really reinforced. And then I think one other area that we maybe didn't mention yet as much is really the grid transition. And that's where maybe a lot of the people listening to are thinking about when they put power and utilities at the forefront of this digital embrace. And there's huge opportunity, but there's also a big question mark from or barriers from my end that I hope we get to discuss together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's an interesting area. Going back to your point previously, so Microsoft sees commercial opportunity here, the big partnerships with BP and Shell and others. You're basically tying the knot closer between some of your important clients. But it sounds like also you're looking to benefit yourselves from your own net zero goal or carbon negative goals. Susan, is that the same as Schneider? I know Schneider is, proud of its sustainability values and has net zero targets too. Is there an element there of wanting to sell these digital services to partners to also learn from it yourself or help meet your own scope 3 goals?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we have been working on becoming a sustainable corporation for over 10 years now. And as you work on your own decarbonization, obviously you build a lot of capabilities. And as you may all be aware, Schneider was named as the most sustainable company globally by Corporate Knights in January of this year. then we couple that with the fact that we see in our company the future as being electric and digital. And we have built a lot of capabilities from a digital technology standpoint and also from an energy management and automation standpoint. So when you bring it all together and you tie it to our mission, which is that we want to enable our clients to be sustainable and to be able to have progress while bridging to ensure that we're using wisely the resources that are finite. So when you bring all of this together, we're very, very well positioned to be the digital decarbonization partner for our clients. And that's really our mission.
And specifically, if you found, I guess I'd love to hear an example or two from maybe Susan, you first, and then Veera, of companies you've worked with or examples where you've really helped a client reduce their emissions due to your digital services.
I'm not sure if the question was for me, but you know what? I'm going to take the opportunity. A great example would be Walmart. You know, they have a mission to remove a gigaton of emissions from their suppliers, and what they have done is, working in partnership with Schneider, they've made available to their suppliers renewable energy by aggregating PPA at their level. So one of the roadblocks for companies to embark on decarbonization is sometimes access to knowledge base and access to those tools that will help them on their journey. And bold movers, I would say, like whether it's Microsoft or Walmart, they're enabling an ecosystem whereby people can get that support. And Schneider is partnering with those companies that have bolder goals in terms of climate actions.
Okay, great. So we've heard now about oil and gas companies and grid companies, and you mentioned Walmart, some big, really consumer and retail supply chain companies. Veera, do you want to give us a couple of examples from the work you're doing with kind of the heavy industry, hard to abate sectors?
Sure, absolutely. The key thing that we're finding from a circular perspective is, as a business, we intentionally started in the complex global supply chains, primarily driven through the automotive sector, and particularly in the creation of the electric battery for EV vehicles. As a consequence of that, we've been able to not just track and provide the chain of custody of the raw material itself, but we've been able to, through that supply chain, understand exactly the energy consumption, the energy power usage, but also the trade-off that happens in terms of the second use of material. So from a battery perspective, not only are we tracking the materials that are required to produce the actual battery itself, but also the second life and third life, and therefore the reuse of some of that energy components as they go into second uses. And what we're now finding is that because of the complexity of the calculations that go into understanding Scope 3 emissions, that's actually driving a very different narrative. And to date, most of the sustainability benefits have been incidental. And what we're now having conversations with our clients with data is being able to create intentional benefits and intentional outcomes as a result of the data that we're collecting.
Interesting. So it seems like many of these partnerships, maybe your relationships, might have begun from cost benefits, or in Microsoft or Schneider's case, energy efficiency obviously is also a cost benefit and a climate benefit. There are other reasons to do digitalization. To your point, Veera, maybe we're seeing clients only beginning to see decarbonization as a priority or the reason to take on a project. It does look like from Danya's talk earlier, she showed there is a big growth in these partnerships and projects, but we are still at the relatively early stage. And I imagine you have all three of you have some war stories to tell about, trying to persuade reluctant customers that tracking CO2 matters, trying to get departments to work together. I understand many corporate sustainability departments have very little, they don't hold the purse strings. And so I imagine there's been some challenges. I guess having overcome some of those probably in the middle of some others. Do any of you have any thoughts or advice on the challenges you've encountered and how you overcome them, or how you think we can build this business to get corporates to really care about decarbonization? And Susan, I'm going to ask you first.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I see is sustainability or decarbonization is seen as one of the many competing objectives within a company. But to really do it right, you have to start at the strategy level on embedding sustainability throughout your organization. So you really have to start the discussion and the planning at the C level of your corporation, and then you have to ensure that you do the right level of investment and right level of change management within the organization to see real measurable results. And as we all know, there is very much a lot of investor pressure and reputational impact if sustainability is not done in a measurable way. So my advice would be to always start at the C level, embedding sustainability in the overall strategy, and then ensure that you have all of the people within the organization aligned towards that goal.
So part of your job is also being a bit of a therapist, possibly, for your clients, persuading the decision makers that this matters, and then kind of trickling your way down to the guys that actually are running the power plants or managing the factories. Veera, have you found that similar? Obviously, you have you're coming at this from a smaller company with less resources, so you really have to be careful about who you pick and choose to work with. What are some of the challenges you overcome there?
I think as a small company starting in this space and growing rapidly over the last 18 months, the discussions have usually started in the procurement space, and very quickly we then have to knit together the different conversations internally. So we end up speaking to sustainability, we end up speaking to IT, and then we end up speaking to the finance team. And quite often we find ourselves being the enablers of knitting the conversations together in the organization to drive a sustainability outcome. And then we're effectively chasing the budget, and the budgets are usually split across multiple fields. So quite often we have to try and corral the budget to go along with the intended outcomes that they want to achieve.
So it sounds like it's still in the early stages, really, of working out exactly who to go to or who's going to spend this money. But have you found that same thing, Vanessa, with Microsoft? A number of the partnerships Microsoft's made have been seemingly very kind of C-suite to C-suite level, but I assume there's also a lot of back-end scrabbling around to find the right people to get this stuff implemented.
That's a critical question, and I think we're also really at a tipping point where we've seen so many utilities, so many, including oil and gas companies, automotive manufacturers, making net zero goals, that C-suite engagement is not always there, but is becoming more and more there, and that really helps. Then I think it's how can you create these business cases and how digital can also enable some of these business cases. So some interesting work that we're doing with BP is around CCUS technologies, capture and sequestration of carbon technologies, and that it goes back to the first technology use I mentioned earlier about record and report. It's really mainly about how do you track the carbon as being sequestered, and how do you make sure there's no leaks, and how do you kind of account then the carbon avoided or the carbon kind of stored for any given technology, like hardware technology. And that's an answer of a business case, because the value is going to be in the amount of CO2 that's being stored, and making sure there is traceability around it, or the claims that can be made around it is critical. So it's a need to have. It's not a must have. I mean, it's not like a nice to have. And that's really where we're maybe going more and more, is where do you have these must have sustainability technologies, and going back to the grid. I think it's also becoming clearer and clearer, at least to grid operators and also to some utilities, that it is going to be a must-have. Then that doesn't mean there isn't any barriers. We still are facing a number of barriers, particularly with traditional kind of grid operators and regulated utilities in the US, and that has to do just with incentives, or the way they've typically made money, the capex versus opex situation. But I think there's more awareness of how do we make that change, because we know that if we want to go to a carbon free grid by 2035 in the US, in similar time frame in Europe or other geographies, we will need to have these technologies to manage the system. So identifying
definitely.
the must-have, I think is, and it's not easy, but trying to find the ones that really kind of can make a change and then roll with that.
Yeah, and sustainability until quite recently was seen as a nice to have for many companies. And now it feels like software is essential as an opportunity, not just to reduce carbon emissions, but to your point, also capture entirely new markets like smart grid or CCUS. It does feel like there's a lot of really interesting areas where companies can finally see revenue opportunities from the sustainability projects they're working on. Have you seen that, Susan, with some of the kind of manufacturers you've been working with? It feels like sustainability was seen as a cost center until quite recently. And now, as Vanessa said, it's almost a need to have for certain projects.
Absolutely. It's also a competitive advantage in the marketplace, because everybody's worrying about scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3. So as many companies are the suppliers of others, sustainability and having lower emission in your products or services is super important. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a brand impact because people are looking for organization to have a purposeful leadership within their organization. So reputationally, in order to be relevant in the marketplace, you have to think about sustainability, sustainable operations, and resiliency as well, which also comes into play when you think about how you're using your existing resources.
Yeah, definitely. This is such a good conversation. I feel like we could talk about a whole range of other things, but I also know we are out of time, and I'm sure there are lots of great questions from the audience. So I'm going to pass back to you, Veera, and we can hopefully field some of those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I have a question here from Marshall Schmidt for all of our panelists. Marshall is asking, how do the panelists see opportunities for advancing decarbonization through digitization intersecting with 1, increased interest in blockchain in spite of its environmental impacts, and 2, US-China tensions about technology, which are often digital? So Claire, I'm going to let you choose who you want to answer first.
Yeah, well, Veera, let's go with you, because I think, the work you're doing there, certainly you can talk to blockchain's potential.
Absolutely. So we use Hyperledger Fabric as part of the blockchain layer, which means that from a system architecture point of view, we don't require the traditional models of using huge amounts of data or energy in terms of the number of block database nodes that are required. And that's also meant that we've been quite agile in our ability to be able to integrate to many ERP platforms through simple API plugins. So we've kind of moved the conversation away from what was traditionally blockchain to now blockchain enabled.
And what I would say to that is that I would add to that scope 3 emissions coming from supply chain is much higher than the combination of scope 1 and scope 2. So addressing that in a measurable way, which blockchain enables, is super important. So I think companies have focused very much in the past on scope 1 and scope 2. Now scope 3 is something that everybody's trying to address, and this is probably the most complex of the emission challenge that we have in front of us.
And just to add as well, the whole concept behind using blockchain is to be able to create an immutable record. And it's that immutable record that creates the trust in the supply chain and the trust in the scope 1, the scope 2, and the scope 3 emission data. And therefore, from that perspective, it creates a huge amount of capability, but also decision-making and choices within supply chains.
Yeah, I agree with Veera and Susan on the opportunity for blockchain on supply chain tracking. On the US-China question, I think this is an interesting one, but it definitely puts also a focus on cybersecurity and cloud infrastructure for enabling that digitization. And this is definitely a core focus, particularly in talking with utilities. So it often starts there. It's a bit outside of sustainability, but how do you make that transition to a public cloud while ensuring greater security and resiliency to cyber attacks and enabling kind of greater reliance on digital technologies if we move to smart grids and a fully kind of decentralized and multi-directional grid, for example. So that's certainly a key area of focus for a number of teams at Microsoft, not me specifically, so I'm not the best position to speak here, but.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that on US-China tension is that regardless of that, every company needs digitization to drive the outcome of decarbonization. So that remains relevant. And two, perhaps with the trade tensions around the world, reliability and resiliency of your supply chain is again is a topic that's topmost of mind for most of management.
Great, thank you, Susan. So we have a follow-up question to that. What concrete ways can digitization help companies address hard to abate Scope 3 emissions? Who would like to take a pass on this one?
Sure, I mean, go ahead.
Sorry. So one of the things that really does work is creating genuine transparency in the entirety of the supply chain with all the participants, such that we're collecting not just the Scope 1 direct emissions and the Scope 2 spent emissions, but by creating that chain of custody of material, we're able to attach a Scope 3 either at the component level, the batch level, the factory level, or the plant level or country level. And that's what really drives the decision-making in trust, but also the way in which the emissions can be offset.
Yeah, and I would add to that from a Scope 1 standpoint, digitization allows you to bring in efficiency, therefore less resources, which delivers savings on Scope 1. In Scope 2, it's how you power or how you energize the assets that you use. Again, by focusing on more renewables, you're able to reduce your emissions. And by having digital incorporated with your power tells you how that power is being used. And I would just reiterate what Veera said about Scope 3, which is when you know what the inputs are coming in and you have a digital tracking of it, again, it allows you to manage your emission in Scope 3 much better, which is challenging.
I tend to call the supply chain kind of the Matryoshka doll. From my perspective, there is energy or fuel and electricity at every step of the supply chain. And so it's really thinking about what's the easiest to reduce. And maybe it's because I've been focused my whole career on power sector. I think the power sector is maybe easier, but it's like going with what's the easiest to reduce emissions from, and then what's the hardest. And obviously that goes maybe then to the mineral and the mining, and also the steel and cement manufacturing, kind of the materials. And so you need kind of that chain of custody to be able to go as far as your tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 supplier. But at every step, like when you go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, there's a little bit that electricity, there's a little bit that's fuel that's easier to decarbonize by just kind of moving to renewables, doing energy efficiency, or moving to sustainable fuels. And then there is obviously some parts that are much harder to abate that are mostly related to the industrial manufacturing. And that I wouldn't say we found a silver bullet on our side. So,
Vanessa, the next question is actually for you as well. It's from Michel Virel. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. But his question is, what are the main impediments, in your view, to embedding more digitization in the grid?
That's a great question. I think one is definitely the traditional way of making money for grid operators and utilities, and so that CapEx, OpEx, disincentive to digital investment. That's receiving a lot of focus currently. So we may be able to see some changes that will kind of lift that barrier for regulated utilities or some grid operators. And then there is this cloud adoption, cybersecurity, and then there are many questions that needs to be addressed before it gets to what does the digital solution delivers in terms of value. And it goes beyond really the CO2 that's being abated, or it needs to be kind of all-encompassing about energy transition.
Thanks, Vanessa. Claire, do you have a quick fire question for our panelists to close the panel?
Yes, I actually wanted to go back to that first polling question we had, where the audience seemed to be split between majority thinking power and utilities digitalizing fastest, and then there's going to be oil and gas, manufacturing and autos, then oil and gas, and mining and metals. I'd love to hear each of your opinion there. So just with, a sentence, which of those sectors or industries or any other industries do you think are moving fastest to digitalize specifically for decarbonization? And we can go, I guess, maybe Susan, Vanessa, Veera, because that's the order you are on my screen.
So on my side, the segment where energy transition is happening fast is where the focus on decarbonization will be. So power and utilities for sure. And then, of course, on the high consumption side, such as buildings, data centers, will definitely be something that companies will focus on decarbonizing.
I'm kind of split. I think there's two drivers to a fast kind of adoption of digital technologies for decarbonization. It's both consumer demand and regulatory framework. And so I think the oil and gas is also kind of a little bit of a lead historically, just because of how they've adopted digital technologies, invented some of the AI technologies back in the 60s or 70s for subsurface oil recovery. So there's that, but then I also see more regulatory pressure and consumer demand on the power and utilities side, and also on the automotive side. So not a straight answer, sorry.
It's okay. Veera?
I think from my side, it's the automotive and energy sectors, primarily because they're being driven by the regulatory pressures of demonstrating the visibility of materials they're using in their supply chains. And what we're seeing is that because they are much more heavily digitized already, they're much more willing to be pioneers to drive the decarbonisation conversation.
Fab. So a pretty nuanced set of answers, which is exciting for me as a research analyst, because it means there's lots to write about. Thank you so much, all of you. This has been short and sweet, and I think very, very interesting. Over to you, Veera.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to all of our panelists. And Claire's going to stay with us in a moment as well.